What's up, everybody? Well, it's a hot one out there today. Heat index is over 100 degrees, hazy, hot and humid, etc., etc., etc. So, great day to just sit indoors in front of the air conditioning until it's time for me to go to work later this evening. But until then, let's just discuss a few things. Now, 2012 has been a downright miserable year, but I can't let that get in the way of some of the milestones that are taking place this year, such as it's the middle of summer of 2012 right now, which means it's been 10 years since a very, very pivotal summer in terms of my interest in technology, computers, multimedia, etc., that I like to refer to as the Summer of the Geek. Now, the Summer of the Geek was basically the summer of 2002 for me, and back then, 10 years ago, I first obtained my interest in computer hardware, got involved with some computery stuff. I was working on campus at a summer job, and a lot of nice geeky stuff happened that summer. And so it was such a pivotal summer in terms of my interest in computers, computer hardware, multimedia, and things like that, that I figured, why not do a little retrospective of how things were. For example, you know, that summer was the summer where I first got into computer hardware and first became interested in building computers. And this computer that I'm using, this picture right here, which was the following summer, of the first computer I ever built with all the AV stuff plugged into it, and even the keyboard and the consoles in the picture ran through it. This was the result of stuff that began during the Summer of the Geek. So let's take a look back in time to the summer of 2002, and let's have ourselves a nice little retrospective, reminiscing, whatever you want to call it, trip down memory lane, whatever. This is the Summer of the Geek, a retrospective 10 years later.
Isn't it obvious that I'm just trying to waste film? Well, here it is, folks. Here's the computer that I started out with. First computer I ever owned. This was the computer that was supposed to get me through college, but it ended up only barely getting me through, halfway through it, before the power supply conked out. It was a Hewlett-Packard Pavilion, build-to-order 8700, Best Buy special. Now, this computer was trouble from the beginning because this was back when AMD was first starting to embarrass Intel with the AMD Athlon processor line. And so I remember reading the computer magazines back then. I was like, because we were going to go, my dad and I were going to go computer shopping to get me a computer for college after graduating high school and all that stuff. And we decided I'd just look in like Computer World magazine or something like that and see what was out nowadays, or back then nowadays, yeah, that was basically the attitude. So I went and looked through it, and I remember going home telling Dad, yeah, you know, when we go shopping, we shouldn't get Pentium anything. There's this new processor out called an AMD Athlon that's really, really good. Didn't even pronounce it right. It's like Athlon. So, yeah, we went out, and I remember some of the folks that he worked with was like, oh, don't get him a machine with more than 64 megs of RAM, because if the computer has more than 64 megs of RAM, he just wants to play games on it. So we had that discussion, but fortunately, this computer actually did have a discrete video card slot and 128 megs of RAM to start. It came with Windows 98, and this computer was trouble from the beginning. First, it came with Windows 98, and HP didn't officially support the upgrade to Windows 2000. So because of that, they actually desoldered one of the RAM sockets on the Asus K7M motherboard inside this thing, because that way you can only put 512 megs of RAM in the thing max, even though the original OEM motherboard would have supported closer to a gig, because Windows 98 didn't support higher than 512 megs without crashing all over the place, and HP didn't officially support anything on this machine other than Windows 98. Did wind up upgrading to Windows 2000, though. That's another discussion for another day, because it was a pretty interesting story as to how that happened. But this machine was terrible, to say the least. Barely a year after I got it, it started having power problems, where it would restart all by itself and all that other fun stuff. Not to mention, whoever designed this thing must have flunked out of engineering school, because it completely goes against the laws of physics in terms of cooling. For an exhaust fan, it had its proprietary power supply, which was closer to the bottom of the case, but the intake fan was over that. It was up top, there was a little 45-degree fan thing that sucked air in to cool the processor directly and served as an intake fan. So the intake fan on this specific computer was actually higher up than the exhaust fan, and it recycled its own hot air. If you put a CD in that CD drive there, after about 5 minutes, it would be so hot you'd swear the disk was about to melt because of how bad the cooling was. So yeah, this thing was pretty much terrible. And not only that, but the power supply in this computer was 188 watts in a time when 250 watts was considered the industry minimum in order to support a decent system like this. So this machine had power problems, and those power problems didn't get any better when halfway through college I tried upgrading the sound and video card and putting even more demands on the woefully inadequate power supply. So because of this, I was faced with the hard reality of, you know, I should learn computer hardware. But fortunately, that summer, during the Summer of the Geek, I was in the perfect position to learn all about computer hardware.
And here's all that's left of that piece of junk computer. Yeah, I kept the processor because it was one of those video game cartridge processors that AMD and Intel had back then. And I thought it was kind of cool, you know, it looks like a video game cartridge, just keep it around, just for the heck of it. But anyways, yeah, see, this computer was trouble from the very beginning because of this computer was problems. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This computer was trouble from the very beginning. Like I said earlier, it was a build-to-order system from Best Buy, and I didn't find out until it was too late that the computer, we ordered the computer with an 800 megahertz Athlon, and what it came with was a 750 megahertz one. But I wouldn't have been able to catch that until it was too late, because my folks were like, "Alright, Jay, we know that now that you got a computer, you're going to be on it all the time, so we want you to turn it on, make sure it works, and then shut it off, take it apart, we're going to pack it up, and you're not going to use it again until you're on campus." So that's basically what happened. I had turned it on, made sure it started up and everything, then shut it off, put it back in the box, and then I had to wait another month before I could actually start using the machine. And by then, of course, it was too late. By the time I figured out how to turn off the BIOS HP Invent splash screen and see that it only had a 750 megahertz processor instead of the 800 that we ordered, it was, of course, way too late. And of course, this is Best Buy we're talking about. They're not exactly great when it comes to service. Oh, did I also mention this was the first and last extended warranty / service plan that I've ever been involved with anything? Yeah, my dad was like, "Oh, so what do you have in case it breaks?" And the kid in the blue shirt was like, "Well, we got service plans, blah, blah, blah. If anything happens, we'll send someone out to the college to fix it." And, "Oh, that sounds good. How much?" "Oh, $300, $400. So on top of the cost of the system already, and this is back in the day when a decent computer still costs like $1,500. So on top of the cost of the system, now we had to add in an extra few $100s for a service plan. Well, when I first started having these problems with the machine, I tried invoking the service plan, but but Best Buy completely and totally gave me absolutely gave me the runaround, and did everything they possibly could to not actually send someone out to fix the machine. So that ticked me off so much that was one of the reasons why I wanted to get involved with PC hardware in the first place, was to fix the machine that housed this little thing. Makes a good paperweight at the very least. Anyways, so yeah, that machine was just bad, and then Best Buy blew me off, and then that summer I was working on campus with some fellow geeks. We were all the folks that work in the various places on campus for the summer. We're all housed in suites together. So I was in a suite full of geeks that were into things like networks and servers and PCs. And actually, one of my suite mates that summer actually built himself a new computer, and borrowed one of my video cards to do so, because I had upgraded my video card, and he borrowed the old one to test his new machine with. This was the guy who built that system I mentioned earlier that had the 60mm fans. So the only way that system could get any decent cooling was for the thing to sound like a hairdryer. So it was like, because of the really small fans. Yeah, he didn't pick a very good case, and the machine didn't work on the first try. He had to RMA the processor a couple of times, but with how the guy was slamming things into place, I can see why. He didn't use a grounding strap either, and when he borrowed my video card, he's like, you know, I'm like, oh man, it's electronics, you gotta be careful with that stuff. You know, that's when I knew that people who build computers that don't have formal backgrounds in electronics probably aren't the best people to build computers, because they're slamming stuff together and not using grounding straps. And probably the worst example of that kind of stuff that I've seen was one time I went to a PC repair shop around here. So I was like, hey, you know, you guys hiring? But I saw this lady in there fixing computers with a power drill. She was drilling a motherboard with a power drill, using a power drill as a powered screwdriver, which is a bad thing to do because, yeah, it speeds up your repairs, but if that drill bit slips and you slash a copper trail on the motherboard, yeah, that's not good. So, yeah, it was pretty interesting. So I was housed in a suite with a bunch of fellow geeks, and it was basically something to brag about if you got out of your job early enough to go home and watch the screensavers every single night, which, by the way, was in its heyday on Tech TV. Now, I first saw the screensavers back when it was Leo Laporte and Kate Botello back in 1999. I was out watching TV, my dad was flipping some channels, we came across this computer show. We never seen a show so computery in our lives here, because Tech TV was ZD TV back then, and it was, I think it was Leo Laporte and Kate Botello on the screensavers back then, but that show is actually where I first learned about Linux, because they were talking about the now defunct Corel Linux back when Corel was still making a Linux distribution. So I was like, Linux? I'm gonna have to give that a shot when I got my computer off in college. And then, of course, when I tried installing Linux, I learned how to partition a hard drive the hard way by completely blanking out my brand new out-of-the-box computer, barely a month out of the box, and having to learn how to repartition the hard drive, reinstall Windows. Great way to learn how to fix a machine that wouldn't boot, that's for sure. So, yeah, but that episode of the Screensavers back in 1999 was when I first learned about Linux. And then by the time the Summer of the Geek rolled around in 2002, the Screensavers was an hour-long tech fest every single night. This is before Tech TV started going downhill, and eventually the Screensavers, you know, started to morph into what's now Attack of the Show on G4 and stuff like that. But this is back when the Screensavers was an hour of computer geek stuff every single night, before they shortened it to a half hour, before they started watering down the content, before Leo Laporte and Patrick Norton left Tech TV. This is back in the heydays of the show. You know, the theme song to that show is probably going to be burned in our heads for the rest of our lives now, because it was so catchy and stuff like that, with that whole disco-y sounding, twangy guitar stuff. Not to mention, at the time, that very summer, Gateway released their Desktop Diva commercial. By the way, the theme for the Screensavers and Desktop Diva, I found out recently, are both on YouTube, so you just type it in the search box and I'll post links in the video description. Oh, 7 minutes just on this segment. Yeah, this is going to be a pretty big video, big enough to be a special. But anyways, oh yeah, the Desktop Diva commercials. Basically, Gateway parodied Britney Spears and other teen pop singers at the time. That's when we knew that, you know, that somebody who's good looking, did some goofy dancing with fellow dancers, and could barely hold a tune. So, not exactly the next Mariah Carey or anything like that, but, yeah, so Gateway had their Desktop Diva commercials back then, and we saw this, we were like, yeah, geekdom has gone mainstream. If computer companies are parodying teen pop singers and stuff like that. So yeah, basically it was probably the geekiest summer ever for me. You know, it was like something to brag about if you got out of your job early enough to go home and watch the Screensavers at night. So yeah, and one of the guys in my suite built a new computer, and I watched him build his and got some ideas for what would eventually be my first system ever, which I built the following November, and that was when I made my first purchase from Newegg.com. November 1st, 2002 was when I placed my very first order on Newegg.com for the first of 2 orders of computer parts that would eventually become the first computer that I ever built.
Here was the first computer that I ever built, the Silver Bullet, I called it. back, this thing was pretty decent back in its day. It ran off an AMD Athlon XP 2000 for a processor. Started off with 512 megs of RAM and eventually went up to like 1.5 gigs, I think, or I think I hit the 1 gig mark or something like that. But yeah, this was the machine that I built. It ran a heck of a lot better than the HP. It was a heck of a lot more stable than the HP, and unlike the HP, it could actually support upgrades. So by the following year, for the last summer, as I call it, where I was again housed in a suite full of geeks helping out the AV and IT departments on campus, so I actually had a computer that I had built, and I could actually show off my workmanship for the first system ever. To use the term loosely, I don't know if you can call it workmanship too. Yay, you built a computer, but some of the folks who I was with the previous year were like, wow, cool, man, you built a pretty good system. So it was a long way from when the folks in the Geek Suite back during the summer of 2002 saw my HP that I had, and I kid you not, one of the guys was like, ha ha, HP, HP, ha ha ha. First time I'd ever had anyone, anywhere, and actually the only time I've ever had anyone, anywhere, make fun of me in such a childish fashion because of my computer. Yeah, that's when I knew that I was among geeks for the summer, that's for sure. But yeah. As you can tell, I still have the HP's monitor, keyboard, and mouse. I eventually switched to an optical mouse. I had a mechanical mouse up until, there was some there was like, I actually got something from like Overstock. It was either Overstock.com or something like that, but it was one of the few spam messages that I actually took seriously. It was some kind of thing, hey, send us $10 for shipping, we'll send you a free HP optical mouse. So I'm like, okay. And of course, during the last summer, I switched from that HP mouse to a Microsoft IntelliMouse Explorer 3, which is the mouse that I still have all these years later, and it still works. So, yeah, this is a silver. The monitor kept going until the summer of 2004, when it quite literally went out with a bang. I think the flyback transformer or something in the CRT let go. But I was starting the computer up, all of a sudden, boom! Big spark flies up to the ceiling, and that was the end of that monitor. And I bought the Samsung tube that you've seen me use in some of these videos shortly thereafter, and it was that Samsung was the last tube monitor I've had. The keyboard was a PS2 keyboard, so I eventually switched it out with a Microsoft Digital Media Pro, and of course we know the mouse got replaced. And this was my setup that I had during the Geek Suite. During this Geek Suite days of the summer of 2003, the last summer. With the experience that I'd gained that all began in the summer of 2002, I very much got into computer hardware. Here were the results of it. Of course, the case that I ordered from Newegg was the version of the case of that silver Chief Tech case that I wanted to get from Newegg for this computer was out of stock, so I paid a little more and got one with a window. I think it was pretty neat. Could look in, see all the fans spinning and all the spaghetti that I never got around to cleaning up. But yeah, here is the entire setup. And everything was hooked into the computer. I had the consoles hooked into the computer. I could record off of the radio and the cassette deck and the record player from the computer if I really wanted to. And I had the keyboard going in through the MIDI interface, which went through the Audigy drive on the front of the Audigy Platinum at the end of that summer. So I could load some big sound fonts and sound like I had a real drum set going in there, because I was running everything over the Klipsch Pro Media speakers that you see there. They were Pro Media 4.1s that I got at a scratch and dent B-stock sale back in the day, and they weren't all that expensive because they were B-stock. So picked those up, got some nice speakers going, got a TV card so I could put the on-campus cable through my computer monitor, watch the screensavers from across the room. So, really great setup, and I don't think I've had as good of a setup ever since. Things have changed in the hardware world such that these all-in-one setups are nowhere near as practical as they used to be. So I don't do that anymore, but that's not to say that back in those days there wasn't some of that AV-type stuff and IT stuff going on as well. So yeah, definitely fun stuff. The thing is, one of the folks that I knew on campus actually brought a drum kit into the radio station during the summer, because nobody was doing radio shows or anything. And there were times when you walked past where the radio station was, you'd hear him banging away on his drums, and then here I was with sound fonts and stuff, and it would sound the same with this geeky setup. But anyways, I'm rambling here, so let's just take a look at what the Silver Bullet is nowadays. Because unfortunately, time was not very good to that computer at all.
Well, all these years later, here's what's left of it. Just a case and a motherboard. Sadly, the Silver Bullet had to be dismantled before its time because of a little something going on back in the early 2000s, which is called capacitor plague. Yeah, the Silver Bullet sadly was a victim of capacitor plague. Here's what's left of the Epix 8K3A Plus motherboard that I had at the time, and you can't see it as much because the residue has kind of dried off and flaked away over the past several years, but yeah, the capacitors had a bit of a capacitor plague problem. Look at all these. Look at all these caps with the crap still left on them all these years later. Capacitor plague was an infamous electronics problem that took place in the mostly in the early 2000s, but some devices that were affected by this defect are still around today. Basically, somebody was trying to do some industrial espionage over in Taiwan, I think, stole an incomplete formula for the electrolytic paste that goes into these kinds of capacitors. The net result was an entire slew of defective capacitors, which would produce hydrogen gas under normal operation. So what happens when gas is building up inside something shaped like a little soup can? It eventually bulges and eventually bursts. And unfortunately, this motherboard had a lot of defective capacitors that, one of the things that these electrolytic capacitors are used for is to regulate, not to regulate, but to smooth out voltage going to something to try and make the power as clean as possible. So all these capacitors around the processor started bulging, and this processor started getting bad power. The net result of that was at its worst right before I dismantled this computer for good. Getting this computer started was like trying to start an old carburetor car. You could try to start it, but it wouldn't stay running until the thing was warmed up. Yeah, I never thought I'd use lingo that you normally describe a cold-blooded carburetor car with to describe a computer, but that's exactly what happened here. I still have the motherboard. I think the local scrapyard will actually let me recycle it because they recently expanded into e-waste. So I got to give them a call, see if they can take this off my hands. But I've been meaning to make a video about this for a long time. One neat thing though is if I take this processor off, all the pins underneath, this processor actually doubles as a nice little comb, little geek comb with all the pins underneath the processor. Not like I'm going to be doing anything with this old Athlon 2000. I think nowadays it would be a Sempron, if anything, if this chip's even still being made. See, this is back in the days before they put the heat spreader on the chips, when you just have 4 rubber things and then the die would be right there. So there were lots of people that were cracking their dies on their processors when they tried putting the heatsink on if they weren't careful. Not good. Plus, chips gave off a lot more heat back then. Especially the last generation of Pentium 4s that made Intel have to modify the ATX standard with a little something called TAC, Thermally Advanced Chassis, allowing for direct air intake over the processor and video card and GPU because of all the heat that the last generations of Pentium 4s gave off. But yep, this is what's left of the motherboard, sadly. And it's quite a shame because the machine ran a-okay until I started getting some of these bulging capacitors, and then the stability of the thing went completely downhill. As for the case, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this case at all. It would still work perfectly if I wanted to put another computer inside of it. The only problem is the design is very dated. First, obviously these types of cases were common in Alienware machines back then. That's one of the reasons why I picked this. Plus it was big, it was easy to work with. Nice decent case. Hey, the power button even still works. All these buttons still work. I could theoretically just put a new computer system inside this thing, except for one fatal flaw. Let's take the cover off of this thing here. That's our problem right there. 80 millimeter fan slots. This is from back in the days before 120 millimeter became the standard that it is now. Nowadays, 120 millimeter is like bare bones in terms of fan size. But this whole thing ran off of 80 millimeter fans. This is also back in the days before power supplies started regulating fan speed, or motherboards came with onboard fan controllers to only spin up the fans when they were needed. So you'd have to buy a fan controller and spin some dials around, try to figure out where the sweet spot was between having a loud computer and having a cool computer. So yeah, it wasn't good back then. This was the loudest machine I ever had because it only supported 80 millimeter fans, which, believe it or not, was pretty standard back then. There are actually still cases with 60 millimeter fans for a full-size desktop. People just didn't do very much with fans larger than 80 millimeters. It was kind of an enthusiast item back then. Then of course, people started getting it. Larger fan, slower RPMs for the same cubic feet of air per minute to be pushed through them means quieter computers if we put bigger fans in them. So nowadays you have cases that support 120 millimeter, 140 millimeter fans, 250 millimeter fans. It's just crazy. So sadly, there's nothing at all wrong with this case, except I never ever want to use it again because of these itty-bitty fans in it. Plus, it's aluminum instead of steel. This case may look like the Tuxedo's case upstairs, and it's the same basic design. But this case is aluminum instead of steel, so it's very, very light. So it's nice and light, runs a little cooler because aluminum dissipates heat a little bit better than steel. But there are some notable drawbacks. First, the metal is flimsier than an equivalent steel case. Secondly, because of the flimsier metal, it's more susceptible to vibration noise. So fans, drives, everything that vibrates and makes noise inside a computer, it'll be more noticeable with this thing than it would with a steel case, even with rubber gaskets for all the contact points to cut down on the vibrations, which I used with this, by the way. I tried a gasket kit for all the fan screws and the power supply, and it was still loud. Another problem, of course, is resonance. This thing had some resonance problems with the optical drives because the resonant frequency of the aluminum is up there with around what an optical drive would be at when it was spinning at full RPMs back then. So this thing would get really loud whenever your drives were spinning at full speed. It would be like that because the frequencies would match and the whole case would start rattling. So yeah, great case though in terms of airflow. It was better than the 60 millimeter fans and the one that one of my friends in college built. This was the machine that everybody was gawking at, lasted me up until the end of 2005. Although sadly I totally destroyed those USB ports by plugging and unplugging controllers a little too much, trying to use this thing as a replacement for a game console. But what can I say? Everything's come a long way since then. USB ports are better, cases are better, fans are better, and this thing sadly is probably just going to wind up in a scrapyard somewhere because as much as there's absolutely nothing wrong with this case, I have zero reason to ever build another computer inside of this thing, mostly because of those 80 millimeter fans. So, a tip of the hat to the Silver Bullet. It worked good back in its heyday, but not nowadays. Time marches on, and sometimes machines like this get left behind. Finally, I believe no retrospective on the Summer of the Geek would be complete without mentioning books. Well, this is about being a geek, so we gotta mention books somewhere along the line. Specifically, this book, Scott Miller's Upgrading and Repairing PCs. This book, not this specific one, this is the 15th anniversary edition from around 2004. Unfortunately, I don't still have the original version of this book that I got back when I was in college that got me into computer hardware, but I've kept every single book that I've gotten since. And so, roughly every couple of years or so, I go and I actually get a new copy of this book just to see what's new and keep up to date on PC hardware and stuff like that, because this book has been completely and totally indispensable and totally awesome when it comes to anything related to PC hardware. So here's the 15th anniversary edition that I got back in 2004. A couple of years later, got a Barnes & Noble gift card, got the 18th edition, I think in 2008, and then the new one that just came out not too long ago, the 20th edition, which I have both a hardcover and on Kindle. But this book series it's one of those gigantic it's one of those gigantic books where you don't read it cover to cover. You just flip through, and you flip through and you take a look at what you need to take a look at. So there's a section on video hardware, sound hardware, input devices, memory, processors, motherboards, and buses. Basically, every major part of a computer has like a chapter in these books. And every couple of years, I get a new one of these books to stay current. Like this one might still talk about Pentium 4s as being decent processors, because it was from 2004-ish. And of course, we have these three afterwards. But this book series single-handedly got me, gave me some. These also come with companion DVDs, and they come with companion DVD and CD-ROMs. CD on the original one, DVD on all the other ones since then. But one of the things that I've always run into with these books is that the very first book that I got, the companion CD that came with the book, actually showed him building a computer step by step, and this was huge in the days before YouTube, because then I could watch, I could actually watch someone build a computer. And it was pretty nice. It was pretty nice to see him build a computer and start it up and install the operating system and things like that. And yeah, so I just flipped through these books. I brought it with me to read on my own at the job that I had, on the summer job that I had, in the dorm at night when I wasn't watching the screensavers. And basically, I read through this book, and the most notable thing that this book series did for me in college was it ruined the challenge for an A+ prep course on computer hardware that I took later on. By the time I got around to that, I didn't have much left to learn in that class. I almost could have just tested out of it if it was allowed. I just had to learn about processor history and old processors and things like that, which was also part of the course. So it was basically the old stuff that I had learned that was new, so to speak, in that class. But yeah, Scott Miller's Upgrading and Repairing PCs. As long as the new editions of this book keep coming out, I'm going to keep getting them every couple of years to stay current with PC hardware. Even with all the post-PC stuff going on today, it's still good, to know how to fix computers and stuff like that. Never needed a computer repaired for real ever since learning hardware. But yeah, Scott Miller's Upgrading and Repairing PCs, milestone series in terms of books. In terms of books for me, one of the most influential tech books I've ever read, period. And it all started in the Summer of the Geek back in 2002. And I think that about should wrap up this Summer of the Geek, aka Summer of 2002 retrospective. Let me just say that this has definitely been one of the most influential summers in terms of me being a geek, AV geek, computer geek, IT person, etc., and will continue to be so for years to come. I've changed my wallpaper, of course, to one of the last good pictures of the Silver Bullet before dismantling the thing. Yeah, it's got all the drives and everything. CD burner, DVD-ROM, zip disks. Anyone remember those? Yeah, Flash Media pretty much killed those. And of course, floppies, of course, and all that other fun stuff. And it's got a fan controller and Audigy drive from back in the day when all that stuff was still cool to have and whatnot. Anyways, that's enough for retrospective for now. If you like this type of stuff, folks, go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, etc. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.